Good morning, everybody. Hope we're doing well. Hope you had a good weekend. So we are going to start talking about ecological succession. We're going to, watch this video today to introduce it. We will continue with this for the next couple of days. This is going to be, I think, the last major topic in ecology. So succession is a really important phenomenon that happens in our ecosystems. And we're going to talk about what that is and what happens when succession occurs. So just a couple of questions to keep in the back of your mind. How do terrestrial communities change over time? And how do ecosystems recover after a disturbance? So this one here is really going to be the bulk of what succession is, right? Because disturbances happen all the time. You should keep in mind and try and think, what are some disturbances that happen in our ecosystems, right? So there are things that, disturb our environment, that can destroy our environment, and ultimately change the way our environments look, right? So you should be thinking, what are some of those things, right? And just to give you a couple of examples, disturbances could include anything from fires to hurricanes, right? Flooding. Any type of disaster constitutes a disturbance, right? The ecosystem will change, the environment will be disrupted, and that could be due to a natural disaster. It could be due to humans, right? Human impact. We tear down trees, deforestation, right? We take our environments and we build homes and we build shopping malls and we pave roads and make highways right through the forest, and all these things disturb the ecosystem. So this idea about recovery, right? How do the ecosystems recover after that? That is what succession is, and we're going to talk about that in detail. All right. So the case study that we're going to focus on for the next couple of minutes is about a volcanic island called Krakatoa. Right? Krakatoa is an island in the Indian Ocean. Okay? It was blown to pieces by an eruption of the volcano in 1883. The island was completely barren of life. Barren means empty, right? So the volcano erupted, it destroyed everything, and everything was killed, right? It was just an empty island. There were no living organisms. So what ended up happening? After the eruption happened, change almost immediately started, right? Near immediate. Within 2 years, we saw grass started to grow again. 14 years after the eruption, there were now 49 different plant and animal species on that island. And 46 years after the eruption, there were over 300 plant species. Today, the island is blanketed by mature rainforests, just like we see here. So the question is, how did the ecosystem recover so quickly? How? And you may be thinking to yourself, 46 years later, 100 years later, right? This happened in the 1800s. So this is now, we're pushing on 200 years almost afterwards. And you say, that's not really quick. But in reality, it is. Right? 200 years as far as the ecosystem concerned is not that far, not that long. There are trees that are alive today that are over 200 years old. There are trees alive today that are, nearing 1,000 years old, if not older. The redwoods, right? All these big trees were really, 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 really old. So how did the ecosystem recover after that disturbance? What happened that allowed all of these species to grow, even though the ecosystem was completely destroyed by a volcano? The idea of ecological succession, right? So succession occurred. So ecosystems change over time, especially after disturbances. So ecosystems naturally change, but they also change over time after a disturbance occurs. Species may die and new species may move in. That's just a natural thing that happens in ecosystems. Ecological succession, however, is a series of predictable changes that occur in a community over time. So succession are changes that happen in a community over a given length of time. And the length of time varies depending on how bad the damage is, right? If there's a very small fire that only burns down a small part of a forest, it's going to be, a pretty short time frame between the changes. But something like Krakatoa, where the island was completely destroyed, that took hundreds of years to change. So it varies, but succession is just talking about the changes that occurs. The changes are the same, no matter what. It's just how long does it take. Something important to remember, biodiversity will generally increase during succession. We spoke about biodiversity. We know that it's the variety of organisms in an ecosystem. This will increase during succession. Why? Because before the succession took place, there was some sort of disturbance. Everything was already destroyed. So, during disturbance, during disturbance, biodiversity would decrease. However, during succession, biodiversity increases because now there's going to be new species, new organisms being repopulated in that area. Okay? So the succession timeline can occur during a time frame, right? And sometimes that's a few weeks, but sometimes, like we see with Krakatoa, could be hundreds of years. It can take hundreds, even thousands sometimes, of years for a disturbed forest to develop into something known as a climax community. We're going to talk about what that is probably tomorrow. But climax community, we're going to see what that means soon. For now, just make sure you write down that phrase. It could take only a few months for insects and fungi to break down cowscat back into the soil. So cowscat is dung or, feces. So we're just seeing the difference in time. It depends on what needs to be fixed. It depends on what was disturbed, and it depends on how significant the disturbance was. Something like rebuilding a forest can take hundreds of years, but something like just breaking down some dung, that can only take a few months, maybe even a few weeks. So succession timeline steps. So this is a succession of a forest, but in reality, the succession timeline is pretty universal for most environments. The first thing that happens are pioneer species. Pioneer species. We then have small hardy grasses and weeds, shrubs and small trees, a young forest, mature forest, climax community. So we're going to go through each one of these in detail so that you understand what each one means. But for now, I'd like you to just make sure you copy down the timeline. So when a forest burns down and succession begins, you're typically going to see succession happen in these steps. The first thing you're going to see is pioneer species will grow. That's number one. After the pioneer species grow, you're going to start to see small hardy grasses and weeds grow. After that, shrubs and very small trees. Then something called a young forest, then a mature forest, and then finally a climax community. And we're going to talk about what each one of these are in more detail in the next video. This is just to show you what the succession timeline looks like. So at number 1 here, this is barren, right? Like we said before, empty. Notice there are no plants. There's no life. We just see the concrete, empty. So as succession occurs, you start to see this timeline of things growing. You see your pioneer species here, right? Little bit of shrubs, just tiny little things. And then it starts to get bigger and it starts to increase as you move throughout time. So slowly, the organisms start to repopulate and start to grow again. And it gets more complex. So here is least complex, and up here is most complex. On this side, we also see less biodiversity. Here we see more biodiversity. Okay? And this is really succession in a visual. You might see something like this on a test or on a quiz or on a homework. Just know that this is showing you succession. And as you move throughout time, the ecosystem will recover and it will regrow these organisms, and it becomes more complex and more biodiverse until it finally reaches climax, which is here. Climax community. And climax community, which we're going to learn about, but I'll just tell you now, means that the ecosystem has recovered fully, right? Recovered fully, and it is back to original state. So at this point in succession, at climax community, the ecosystem has recovered to the point that it was at before the destruction even happened. It's back at its climax. All right, guys, so we're going to end here. And then starting with tomorrow's video, we're going to start to look at each of those steps of succession and talk about them in more depth. All right, if you have any questions, please reach out. Make sure you filled in your notes. Have a great rest of your day.